Okay, so let's get going. So the first thing, an explanation of what a workflow is made up of. So there are really two parts that a workflow is made up of, and that is the trigger and the steps. So what is the trigger? It's the thing that starts the workflow from occurring. And so this could be when you add a new person into the system, or it could be when you add a person to a group, or if you change a value on a field on their profile, then that can trigger the workflow from carrying out a number of steps for you automatically. So those steps might include something like sending them an email or updating a value on their profile or multiple values. It could be adding a note or a to-do on their profile. So we'll go through those things in details, but that's basically how a workflow is constructed. So the permissions for workflows. To be able to actually create a workflow, you need certain permissions on your role. So I would imagine most of you here are administrators of your site. If you're not though, your administrator can manage your permission for you. So under administration, under roles, if we edit an existing role, say you might be a staff member, we'll edit this role. And down the bottom, under this section, workflow, you need to have access workflow administration. Without this ticked, then you will not be able to see this workflow item here. Now you can have access to that workflow item without having access to the rest of the administration. So that's something to note there for your administrators. So that's the only permission that's required. So the next thing we'll talk about in detail, in a bit more detail, are the workflow benefits. So if we have a look at a workflow and we have a look at the new contact workflow, if we edit this one, we can see we've created a workflow called new contact, and the description is to process a new contact record. And so the trigger that's going to start this workflow from occurring is when a person is added to the system or manually from the person screen, which is something we'll talk about later. But then when a new person is added, that's going to trigger this workflow from occurring, and it will carry out these following steps for us. It's going to add a person to the group. It's going to change the person field contact date to the day of the trigger, which is the date that the trigger is set off. It's going to add a note to the person's profile. It's going to send them an email. It's going to change another person's field, and it's going to add a to-do for a task to be created or completed by the staff group. And so it's going to do all of those tasks instantly for you, which means that it's going to save you a lot of time processing new people. So it means that if you implement a process into your organization, then as long as the workflow steps and the triggers can fit in with your process, then you're going to be able to automate things. And automation has a lot of benefits.
Good, yourself.
Oh, sorry, I'm just going to mute everyone there.
Very good.
So if you need to speak, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, that'd be great. Okay, so having automation obviously is going to save you time, but it's also going to do a number of other things as well. It's going to mean that your users that you interact with or you process through the system are going to have a consistent experience. So everyone is going to be processed the same way. Now you can potentially have multiple workflows to manage people differently depending on their circumstances, or you might have different branches of your process that they need to go down. But it means that the integrity of all the data that goes through is going to be the same for each person that's gone through the process. Whereas if we were to do this process manually, if we had to manually add them to a group, then change a field, then add a note, then send an email, etc., people, when they do things, inherently make mistakes. And so workflows obviously eliminate that. Of course, you need to set up your workflow appropriately to begin with and make sure it actually meets your process needs. But once it is done, then, wow, it saves you a lot of time and things get done consistently. So it's a really great feature. Okay, so let's talk about building a workflow. So we're going to build a workflow from scratch, and we've already created some here for our demonstration, but let's create a brand new one. So let's add a workflow, and the title of the workflow, we'll call it add new contact. Use this in the description. We can describe what the workflow is for. Use this workflow to manage a brand new contact in the system. You can really say whatever you want, what the workflow is used for. Okay, so the trigger, like I said, is to initiate the workflow. Something needs to happen. What triggers this workflow to start? And so here, when a person is added to the system, then this workflow is going to trigger. Now it's going to ask us here two questions. Can the user choose whether to do this? Yes or no? So basically, it's going to ask me when this workflow is triggered, do you actually want this workflow to start? And I can either have an option or not. So in this case, if you want the user to choose, then you can say yes. And what state should the trigger be in by default? Either don't action or action. So if you set it into don't action, it means that the person who is triggering this workflow has to purposefully choose action on the workflow. Now I'll show you what I mean in a second, but it's actually going to require input from their side of things. So you do need to ask yourself a question on whether you want to give them the option and what the default is. So we'll set it as don't action for now. And what steps do we want this workflow to carry out? So here we go, we can send that person an email. And so when we choose this option, it's looking at the email templates that have been set up, that have been saved as system templates, or my own personal templates. But it's really better if we use a system template because other people will see that template in the system. So here we actually don't have a new welcome email template set up. So we actually need to create that first. So we'll leave that blank for now, and we will maybe change a person's field. We'll do that first, and we'll choose the field. It really could be any field. We'll change the member status to a new member, for instance. And we add another step, and we will add a note to the person's profile. And so it's going to go against the person affected or the household, either or, and ask the user for the note at the time. So when I trigger the workflow is going to ask me to put in a note. So it could be a custom note, or it could be use the same note for everyone. So I'm just going to say this is a new contact, be nice, or something, whatever it is. Okay, and you can choose the visibility of that note just like any other note. So we can make that note visible to anyone. Okay, maybe we'll add one more thing. We will add them. What should we do? We might add them to a group as well. Add the person to a group and choose an existing group. Do we have a new contact group? No, we don't. So let's remove that, and we will create those two things. So we don't have a group to add them to, so let's create the group that they need. We'll add a group and call it a new contact group. We'll save that group so that becomes available to add new members into, and we'll create that welcome email as well. So we go into contact and create the content of that template. Add the personalization in it. Now we're just going to say this is a welcome email to our new contacts. Okay, so really this email template could actually have some real content in it that you could send to your new contacts, but we're going to save this as a new contact welcome email template and save it as a system template. So when we save it as a system template, this is making it available to all users in the system that use email, and also makes it available in workflows for people to create workflows from. So if we go back into administration and into workflows, then our add new contact workflow, we can now edit this and add in those additional steps that we want. So we can add another step, and we'll go add the person to a group, and we'll choose our new contact group, and we'll also add in send email, and we'll choose our, where is it, new contact welcome email. There we go. So that's how we've created a workflow. So if we save this, then that workflow is actually ready to go. And so let's just jump back in there and have a quick look at how to actually action this. And that's based on the trigger. So if we edit this, then the trigger was when a person is added, right? So let's have a look at that trigger to begin with. So if we go to the top and we add a new person or household, I'm going to call this person Wendy Workflow. Okay, I have to fill out the mandatory fields. Of course, I need to add in an email address for the email to work. So I'll add in that email address and answer any mandatory fields. And so down the bottom, before we actually create the contact, it's asking what workflows we want to trigger. Now, do you remember we set two options? We said, do you want the user to be able to choose whether to do this? So that's giving us an option to either action or ignore. And the default we set was to ignore. So if we were to set the default to action, then that would have been set to action, which means that it wouldn't require a positive input from us to process. So in situations where you definitely want that workflow to occur every single time, then it's better to set the default to action. If you don't want to give your users the choice whether to action that workflow or not, then you remove that choice from them. So we've selected action for our new contact. We click on next and workflow home. Doesn't really matter what we call this, and we'll save that. Okay, so we've just added a new person into the system. That's all we've done. But Infoodle has done a few things for us. So you can see it's added that note for us. This is a new contact, be nice. Under their involvement, it changed that field member status to new member, which is one of the actions. And under the history, where is our history? Under our history tab, you'll see that they've also received that email. This is a welcome email to our new contacts. So as you can see, that's a basic example of how workflows can work when you're adding a new person to the system. Now, workflows can also work from forms as well. So if you were to create a new person from a form, the same thing would have happened, except the workflow details come up slightly differently. So let me just quickly demonstrate that to you. Let's work with what form? The new donor form. We'll quickly fill out one of these. Go to the link here. Okay, we'll call this person William Workflow. And we'll submit that. Okay, so it's not a form training, so we won't go into any detail there. If we refresh that form, new donor form will process this form entry. So we've got the form entry here, and we need to process this. And so if we create the new person, then here it's going to see, please choose which workflows to run, and I can run the add new contact workflow, and I can approve the form. Okay, so now we've got Wendy Workflow and William Workflow, and you'll see the same actions have happened for William as well. Okay, so there is one more thing that I do need to describe with forms, and that is this worked for a new person being added to the system, but if your workflow also needed to be applied to an existing person in the workflow, an existing person in the database, then we do need to process it slightly differently. So I'm just going to fill this out again to demonstrate. If I fill out William Workflow again, same details. I'll submit that, doesn't matter about the email address. Then under the new donor form, I'll process that form entry. And we'll assign these details from that form to the existing William Workflow person in the database. If I assign that, then we don't see that same new contact workflow that we saw before. This one is a different one, so ignore that. But the reason why we don't see this is because we're not creating a new person in the system. We're actually assigning that data to an existing person. And so there is another trigger that we need to add to our workflow to be able to cater for this. And so I'll show that to you. Under administration workflow, we will edit our existing one. So which one was it? It was add new contact. So if we edit this, we had one trigger here, add a person. When a person is added, then this workflow will trigger. Or you can have multiple triggers. Then you can say manually from the person's screen. And so when we add the manually from the person's screen trigger, this adds on the ability to either trigger the workflow directly from the person's profile. If we open up William here, we can go to the cogwheel and we can say add to workflow. And any workflows that have been added that trigger manually from the person's screen will be included in this list. So we can now click on add. And you'll see that workflow is triggered all over again because there's a second record of everything that's been done. So that will also trigger from a form when you're adding an existing, or you're including a form entry for an existing person in the database. Okay, so that's workflows from forms. Now, are there any questions so far? I know we've gone through a fair bit so far, but if there are any questions, please feel free to jump in.
Just a quick one. So if you say add email as part of the workflow, is that immediately sent or is that delayed?
Okay, so that it depends really. In the situation that I've just shown you, it's immediately sent. But you can actually delay what happens through a workflow if there are things in between, such as tasks or to-dos. So basically, you can delay the steps after a to-do has been completed. So that's a possibility of delaying. And when we get to work queues as well, you'll see a way of manually being able, well, it's not really part of the workflow, but yeah, I'll show you something else later on, which might answer your question.
Thank you.
I've got a question, Sylvia, here. When you're setting up a template for a welcome new member, can you make that a template that you've made in MailChimp, for example, so it looks a bit fancier than just, you know, a plain email, like
Right,
something
that's a
that
good
looks
question,
pretty?
Sylvia. To be honest, I don't think you can do that, Sylvia. But that's a good question. It's something I would need to test and get back to you on, but I don't think you can.
Okay, yeah, because our pastor's sort of not wanting to use this to send out initial emails because he wanted to see it fancier.
Right.
Okay.
Well, yeah. Well, maybe we can work with you on it because there are ways to make the email from infoodle look very nice with images and some formatting. So perhaps we can work with you on that. So I don't think it's something we should really get into in this session
No,
because the
that's
focus
okay.
is on
I
workflow.
thought you might have said, oh, yes, you just copy and paste, blah, blah, blah.
Sure,
And
sure.
Yep. Okay, that's cool. Thank you.
I'll definitely look into it and get back to you.
Thank you.
So Frank's got a question as well. Is it possible to have a trigger for a person added after a name reconciliation with Xero? Frank, no, that's not possible. In fact, workflow can't be triggered by financial inputs for anything, and they also don't have any steps for finance as well. It may be something that we'd like to do in the future, though. Okay, so let's see where we're at so far. All right, so the next things we need to cover, we've covered multiple triggers, adding a trigger options. Okay, let's look at the different types of steps and we'll cover those things. So just minimize these windows here. So under workflow, if we go into add a new contact and edit that, let's look at the different types of triggers first. So we can add a trigger when a person is added, when a group has a member added or has a member removed. That can also be a trigger. When a person field, you choose the field, is either set or changed, or if it's a multi-select lookup or a lookup list, then something like member status is set to any value or the values that are included there. Or when a household field is changed, it's the same as the person field except for the household. Or when an email is added or changed or deleted, or manually from the person's screen. So there are lots of different types of triggers, but there's not one there for Xero reconciliation for contacts. Sorry, Frank. Okay, so those are the triggers that are there. Obviously, if any one of those triggers is actioned or set, then it's going to trigger that workflow or ask you if you want to trigger that workflow. Okay, so the other types of steps that are possible. So we've covered changing a person field, adding a note, adding a person to a group, sending an email. So there are a few other things that you can do. You can send text messages. Again, that's the same as sending an email. You'd need to create a template. Make an email address inactive. And so this is useful for unsubscribing of, like for an example, you could have a link in your emails that you send for people to unsubscribe from. So when they fill out that form and you process that form, then you could trigger this workflow to do a few things, but one of those things might be to make the email address inactive so you can't email them anymore. That's an example. And saying that we do have a new unsubscribe process coming through, so that will probably be invalid shortly. Got another question. Can you do a workflow for everyone that has completed a form? E.g., if you have a form that 100 people have completed, can you set up a workflow to add an answer to a question on the form? Okay, so I don't think so, Wendy. That might be something that we need to talk about outside of the session. It sounds quite specific, but it sounds like you need a step to fill out an answer on a form, which is not an existing step. There may be other ways to get around that though, so I think it's probably a conversation we need to have privately.
Okay, Ta.
All right, so other steps here, we can add or remove people from groups. We can change permission, person's permission in a group. So you could change them from just a view-only member to a administrator or something. You could update MailChimp or unsubscribe from MailChimp, add notes, to-dos, and work queues and workflows. So when you create a workflow, you can also trigger other workflows from that workflow, only if you use this particular step. So if you add a workflow, then you choose the next workflow you want to trigger when the workflow gets to that stage. So that could be a flow-on effect sort of a process. So that can be quite useful. So those are the different types of steps. So from now, I think we need to get into the different examples that you can use workflows for. So we've just given a basic example of how to create a workflow for adding a new contact, but it can also be used for other things, which is really useful, like bulk archiving people in the system, for an example. So let's leave this workflow now and show you another one here. We've got bulk archive. If we edit this, then we can see that the title is bulk archive. It doesn't have a description, it's not necessary. But the trigger is when group bulk archive, which is a group I created, has a new member added, then can the user choose whether to do this? Yes, and what state should it be in? By default is don't action. And the steps that it'll carry out will change a person's field to archive is yes. Okay, so it's quite a basic example. And we can save this. And so to bulk archive people, well, we could open up one person's profile. We'll open up this test account and we could go into groups. Where's our groups there? And we could add her to the bulk archive group. And it's going to say these changes are linked to workflows. Please choose which workflows to run. The bulk archive one, action. Okay, so we could have set that to always action or don't give the user an option, and so we wouldn't have even seen this. But just for our demonstration, I wanted to show you. So click on save. Oh, please complete all the required fields. Oh, okay, more. Okay, and save that. Okay, so now that I've saved that, if I refresh the page, we'll see that Kim is now archived. So I think under edit, we have got our archived field, I think under involvement. So archived was changed to yes. And so it was changed automatically only because she was added to that group. Now that doesn't seem that efficient to me because we still have to change a person individually from the profile. So instead of doing it that way, let's run a report. So if we go into reports and go into people, and now perhaps, I know my database off by heart here, so, well, not off by heart, but I know some things. So I want to archive everyone in the system that doesn't have their name set. So I'm going to say first name is not set, and add criteria. Where's surname? There we go. Surname is not set. Let's run that, select fields just to confirm my thoughts here. So first name, last name. And so we've got 13 records of people that don't have a name in the system. They do have email addresses, but for me, I don't want that information in the system, so I want to archive them. All right, so now that I've run the report, I've got 13 people, and I can add them to a group. So I'll choose the group, and choose an existing group, bulk archive. And now these changes are linked to workflows, the same as what we've seen. We can action that and click on save. And now all of those people have been archived automatically for us. So you can see this person without a name is now archived. And so it's managed all 13 people the same way. And so that may be an example, but you might want to find everyone in your system that hasn't donated to you in the last 24 months, and then archive those people in the system. So you can basically action workflows from a report, which is really useful. Okay, so of course, for me to have done that, I needed to first create that group bulk archive and then create that workflow to action. Okay, so that's one example. Let's talk about updating data from reports. So let's have a look at something in the system. If I run a report and I want to see all of our new contacts. So I know that we're capturing this data under a particular field, under member status equals new member. Just going to confirm that for you. So I choose people's first name and last name and their member status. Generate the results and click on show. So we've got 83 people that are new members. And now I don't have a membership date status field. So if I did, then I could then limit my search for all members that have been a new member for the last 12 months. And then I would get a specific set of people. So I could have added that to the report if I wanted to. But if I wanted to upgrade all of these people from a new member to a active member, for example, then I can run a workflow to do that. So I'm just going to save this report so I don't have to run it again. New member report. And we'll go to administration and we'll create a workflow to update their data. So let's have a look. I don't think we've got anything there. No, okay, so we'll add a new workflow. And we're going to call this new member workflow. I'm going to call this upgrade people from a new member to an active member. So the trigger is when group, let's actually create a new group first. Sorry, don't want to confuse you here. I'm going to call this active members. So we've got a new group here called active members. All right, we're going to use that for our workflow. So if I add the workflow, I'm going to say when a group active members has a new member added, then change a person's field, member status to active member. Okay, so I'll save that and then I'll run that report. So I'm now running the report on the new members in the system. So I'm running the report on member status equals new member because I want to upgrade everyone from new member to active member. So I can generate the results. And then I can choose a group. I'm going to add them to the active members group. And then it's going to ask if I want to trigger that workflow and click on save. Okay, so of course, because I could have just added them into the active members group, but that wouldn't have kept the information on their status consistent with what group they're in. And so by creating that workflow, I've added them to the group, but I've also updated the fields of information on their profile at the same time. So now if I run this report again and click on show, then I've got 0 results because all of those people have now been changed from a new member to an active member. So if I run that report and click on show, you'll see that I have 100 people there because there are already existing people with active membership. Okay, so we have a question here. Okay, no worries, Sylvia. Thanks, we'll catch up later. Okay, so that is another basic example. All right, so another example of using a workflow would be managing groups. So for an example, if you added a person, here we've got a list of groups for our staff members, for instance. We've got our finance staff, our general staff management, and staff admins. Now, a person in this situation should only be a member of one of these groups and not the others. And so if we were to manually add a person to the general staff group, then we'd need to check all 3 other groups to make sure they weren't a member of those groups, which is really quite frustrating. So instead, we can create workflows to manage these groups automatically for us. And so I've created a series of 4 workflows to manage this for us. So under administration, we'll have a look at those workflow. Then we've got these 4 workflows. Okay, so let's look at one of them for staff group. If we edit this, so the trigger is when group finance staff has a member added, then remove the person from general staff management and staff admins. Now, it doesn't matter if they weren't actually a member of those groups to begin with, but if they were, then they will be removed. Okay, so that's if we add a person to the finance staff, it's going to remove them from any of the other 3. And so I've created 4 of those for each one of the groups. So we've got one for general staff as well. If we edit that, when a person is added to the general staff group, then have them removed from the other 3 groups. So let's test this out. We'll have a look at someone that is in the existing staff group, staff admins group. So we've got Graham Henry here. So we'll test out Graham Henry. So let's open up his profile. So we'll go into the groups field, and so we're just confirming here he's part of the staff admins group. Now we can add Graham Henry to, well, let's say we promote him to management. He's probably a good manager, Graham Henry. All right, so you can see these changes are linked to workflows, action, the staff group management, and you can notice that it's defaulted to action because I want to make sure that this workflow definitely happens every time we make a change to these groups. So I click on save. And if we refresh the page, we go back into groups, we can see he's no longer part of that staff admin group, but he's now part of that staff management group instead. And so that's another example of how we can use workflows to manage groups. Albeit, yes, there is a fair bit of setup to create those workflows, but it ensures that you're going to manage those groups properly. So are there any questions so far on the basics with workflows before we move into something a little more advanced? No, okay. So the next example that I'm going to show you is managing a person through a process. So we created a person before called Wendy Workflow. In fact, I think we'll create a brand new person in this case. Which one should we use? No, we can use Wendy Workflow, that's just fine. Okay, so let's have a look at this workflow. All right, so if we go to administration and workflow, then the first step is this process here, new contact. And so, sorry, I'll give you a bit of context to this. So this example, I've very much simplified a sales process where someone gets in contact with your organization. And so from initial contact, you might want to process them through a particular process, whether that's to demonstrate a product or give them a trial, through to the sign up of your product or as a member in your organization. So that's the example, but just bear in mind that the context of the example is not so important. It's more important for you to grasp the functionality of the workflows that we're taking a person through. So we've created 4 workflows here to manage a person. And if we look at each one, so the new contact workflow here is when a person is added, either added manually from infoodle or from a form, or manually from the person's screen. So that's the trigger, and it's going to carry out the following steps. So it's going to add the person to the contact group. It's going to change a person's field contact date to the date of the trigger. It's going to add a note, send an email, change the person's field to awaiting a booking for a demo, and it's going to add a to-do on the person's profile to follow up with them later. Okay, so that's the process. And so to support this workflow, we've done a few things. First of all, on the person's profile, we've got these different tabs. So we've got a contact tab for when they have initiated contact with us. We've got the tab for demos. So when we're processing a demonstration of our product with them, then we'll fill that out. We have a trial tab that's actually should be rearranged here. Let me quickly do that. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we've got the process there. So we've got contact, demo, if they go through a trial of the product, and then through to the sales of the product. This is highly simplified. Okay, so we've got the tabs to manage the different fields on the profile, and some of those fields are managed by the workflow, and some of them are managed by us. Okay, and we also have built some groups to support the process as well. So we've got the people that have made initial contact with us. We've got them going through the demo, the trial, and then the sales outcome, whether it's complete or on hold or cancelled. Okay, so we're going to take Wendy through this process. In fact, I might just create a brand new person for you to go through this process. So let's add a person. And we're going to call them, I don't know, Georgia Jones. Okay, so we're going to fill out the mandatory fields. Okay, so this is the first step of the process of numbered at number 1. So we're going to action that. Click on next. The household name, test, workflow, doesn't really matter. We'll save this. Okay, so select the date for the item follow-up new contact to be done for Georgia Jones. So this is asking us when we want to do the follow-up with them. So we can then say, let's follow up on Monday with them. She's got a question here. I'll answer that question outside of this session here, Haley, if you don't mind. Okay, so we have now added a person to the system, and the system has updated some things automatically for us. So under contact, we can see the contact date. It hasn't actually said, they haven't added any comments or requested that's something you would manually add, but also the demo has been changed to awaiting booking. And the reason why that is because it's automatically sent an email to this person saying, you're a new contact, basically click here to register for a demo with us, for instance. So you can automatically do those things. And so let's see what the next step of the process is. If we go to administration and go to workflow, the next step of the process is demo. So if we edit this and see what's going on, we can see when person field demo status is changed to received. So they've booked in the demo and we've actually given them the demo of the product. We can then change this to received. And once we've done that, then the system is going to add the person to the demo group, and it's going to add a to-do on the person's profile to follow up with them after that demo. So let's actually do that. Go to Georgia Jones, our new contact, and we've given her the demo, and we'll go into the demo to confirm that. We'll see the demo date was today. That's not affecting the workflow. The demo status is affecting the workflow, and then we'll say received. And the demo was received on today, and the demo result, it doesn't really matter though. Let's click on saved, and we'll action the demo workflow. Okay, so if we click on save there, then they have now progressed to the next step of our process. And so the next step of the process is for the trial. If they are interested in a trial, then we can take them through that process, or perhaps after that demo, they just wanted to sign up. Okay, thanks, Frank. Okay, now under the trial workflow, you can see we can edit this, and this workflow has got some different triggers. So when a person field trial period is set, then this will trigger, and then again, it's going to add in some follow-up to do. So again, it's really the same thing as what I just demonstrated with the demo. So let's progress them to the next stage of the process and say they wanted to sign up. So if we edit the sign up workflow, then you can see that this workflow consists of a trigger that when a person field sales state is set to signed up, then carry out these steps. And so we're going to remove them from the previous groups, remove them from the contact group, remove them from the demo group, remove them from the trial group, and then add them to the sales complete group. And then once they've done that, we probably want to follow up with that person. So we'd add them to a follow-up group and would add in to-dos to follow up with them. So let's take Georgia through that process. So if we click on Georgia, we'll go into the sales tab. The sales date was that, and we'll put her to the sign up and then click on save. And so now it's going to take her through that workflow. And you'll see on the profile, if we refresh, then we have got the follow-ups to complete for that sale. So you can see there, if we complete this, actually I'm going to complete the other ones first to get rid of them. So I'm just going to delete them in this case because they're no longer valid. Okay, so let's complete the sales process. So followed up, you can really say whatever you want to say there. And if we refresh, then it's going to come up with the next to do. So this is going to be at a later period because you want to follow up with them regularly. So this is just giving you an example of completing a process to take a person through in the system. And so instead of having to-dos, numerous to-dos in the system, which I personally would prefer because it adds more accountability to a person or a group of people to complete the task. It also sends out email reminders and adds these tasks to people's dashboards. But instead of having to-dos added to people's profiles, then this is where work queues can take the place of having a list of people to process. So if we complete this again, and refresh the page, then we've finished all our to-dos and followed up with the person. So instead of doing it with to-dos, we can actually do it with work queues as well. So in our workflow, if we go back to administration, and we edit that sales signed up workflow, then you can see the workflow has got these to-dos, which we've just completed. But as another example, we have we can add them to a work queue. So add to a work queue, and we'll say a sales follow-up work queue. And so this would be really instead of these to-dos that we created on the workflow. So to create a work queue, it's done via the actual workflow itself, and you add the person to a work queue. So when you've set that up and you save the workflow, then there is a tab for work queues. So you can see that the 3 work queues have been set up under that workflow, can all be seen here. So if we edit this first one, the person who has created the work queue can make modifications to this. They can give it a work queue name, the purpose of the work queue, who owns the work queue. It can either be an individual or a group of people or a combination of both. And you can also set who can add people to the work queue. By default, anyone who owns the work queue can add people, but you can also give people only access to add people to the work queue instead of being able to modify it. Okay, so you can set the individuals and the groups there. Escalate after how many days? The escalation is relating to if the person is not progressed from one step of the work queue to the next, then automatically escalate them to the following step, or actually what you choose here within the period that you set. So if we save this, I'll show you what I'm talking about. So now we've actually configured the work queue. We can actually process a person through it. So once we create a work queue, we'll receive a new menu item here called queues. If we click on that, you'll see our workflow called sales signed up. And our first work queue here is sale follow-up work queue. And then we've got step 2 and step 3. Okay, this is just a basic example, but we can click on view to see the people in the first step of the work queue. And we can see how we've got a test here that I've done earlier, but we've got one here for Georgia Jones. So this really could be a follow-up to make sure we're staying in contact with Georgia. So once I've called up Georgia or sent Georgia an email saying, hey, Georgia, how are you doing? What do you think of the product? Or how are you finding being a member with us? Or whatever it is, then we can action that and say, okay, we've completed that step for her. So we can remove from queue and go to the next task, which will be the next step of the process, this one here. So let's do that. Or actually the other options is we could skip the step if it wasn't required. Just having a few issues with my Zoom there. Or we could skip the step and go to the step 3, for example, or we can completely remove them from the work queue if that's not required. So let's remove and go to the next task. So you can see that this number has dropped from 2 to 1 and only our workflow test remains. So if we go to the second step, then we'll see that Georgia is in the second step of this current work queue. So again, once we're ready to process this, we can then action that and do the same thing again. We can either remove or skip or completely remove. And so that's processing someone through basically a list of actions that need to be taken. And generally the actions that need to be taken would be external actions from the system itself. And the reason I say that is because if the system was capable of completing those actions for you, then it would be wiser to set up a workflow to automate those things. Whereas with a work queue, because the action is external to the system, you need to take some sort of physical action, whether that's phone calling them or sending them an email manually, then work queues may be more suitable. Now, I personally haven't really come across a real life example of this myself, to be honest. So whether you can apply this to your organization or not, I'm not sure. It may be a discussion that we can have outside of this setting, because obviously it's going to affect your personal circumstances and processes. But basically that's how work queues work. Now I can show you how to add someone to a work queue if you didn't have permission to modify the queue itself. So that means that you wouldn't be able to open this up and view this section here. Then if that was the case, then you could open up Georgia's profile and you can click on the cogwheel and you can add to work queue. So then you can choose the work queue she should be added to, click on add, and then it should be back in step 1 of that work queue. So that would be for people that don't have so much management access, or if you don't want them to progress people through the queue, but just want to initiate that process for them. Okay, so that basically covers work queues. The last thing I need to mention about workflows is when they don't apply or when they're not triggered. So the first example is when the UI is, or when I say UI, I should probably explain what I mean. Sorry, got a question here. Is there a way for a workflow step to make a call to a web service, even a simple GET request? No, there's not a function at the moment, Chris. If you wanted to log a feature request for it, I would certainly suggest doing that. That would be great to be able to do that. But yeah, at the moment it's not. Yeah. Okay. So there are some situations where workflows are not triggered, and so for a workflow to trigger, you actually have to have some sort of input into the system yourself by basically coming into the system and changing the fields or the groups that are going to trigger the workflow from occurring. So it needs to have manual input from you. Where it doesn't happen is, for an example, if you were to have a trigger where the wedding date, if that was changed or set, then trigger the workflow. And then if you were to complete a form for that person and they filled out that field for that trigger on the form, then just because that was filled out on the form and applied to their profile, that's not going to trigger the workflow from occurring. In that situation, you'd need to use that manually from the person's screen function. So another example when a workflow doesn't work, so workflow steps, let me just read. Right, yes. So when a workflow is carrying out steps, and one of those steps is to change a person's field or add a person to a group, then that will not automatically trigger another workflow from occurring if the trigger was impacted by one of those steps on the previous workflow. If you want that to happen, then I'd use that function or the step in the workflow to action another workflow. So if we add a step, then we add a workflow, then choose the workflow that you want to trigger afterwards. So to demonstrate this, here one of the steps is change a person field contact date to the date of the trigger. Now, if we were to create another workflow with this field as a trigger, then this would not trigger another workflow from happening unless you were to manually add that workflow in there. So it's basically creating it's stopping a cycle of workflows from triggering each other in the system, basically. But I think that actually covers everything for the workflow training today. If there are any specific questions on your organization, then please feel free to email us or give us a call, and we're more than happy to look into your personal circumstances. I know workflows can be quite tricky, but I'll just encourage you, if it's complicated for you, just to start off basics so you get the basics of the idea. But we're more than happy to help anyone that has any questions, so please feel free to get in contact with us and we'll be happy to help.